Hey besties, stay with me for this one because what looks like accountability at first is about to unravel in real time. A tearful confession, a public redemption arc, and then one quiet interview that changes everything. By the end of this video, you are going to see how a single admission flipped the entire story on its head, and why what was said under pressure was taken back the moment it no longer served him. This is not about growth, it is about control, and once you hear it, you will not be able to unsee it. Hey besties, welcome back to the channel because today we are opening a chapter that at first glance looks like growth, redemption, and reflection. But the more closely you listen, the more unsettling it becomes. And I need you to stay with me all the way through because every part of this story connects and every detail matters. And by the end of this, you are going to understand why this moment was never about change, but about control. It was early in the morning when that familiar realization hit me. Not the kind that shocks you, but the kind that quietly confirms what you already knew deep down. Because this is not the first time we have seen this pattern, and it will not be the last. But the timing is what makes it important, because the finale of Special Forces is approaching, and suddenly Cody is everywhere, doing interviews, presenting himself as reflective, evolved, and accountable. And whenever that happens right before a finale, you should pause, because narratives do not shift by accident. He was asked during a New York morning show interview what challenged him the most about the experience, and without hesitation, he dismissed the physical aspects, the exhaustion, the cold, the pressure, and instead framed it as a mental and emotional reckoning, which sounds impressive until you remember what the show actually focused on during his most intense moments. Because when the clip rolled, the questions were not about strength or endurance. They were about his marriages, his relationships, and most importantly, his children. The drill instructors pressed him on responsibility and whether he had truly taken ownership for the breakdown of his family. And that moment should feel familiar because we talked about it weeks ago when that episode aired, when the emotions were big, the tears were flowing, and the statements were dramatic. And he claimed he was finally owning his mistakes. But even then, something did not sit right, because in the same breath that he claimed accountability, he admitted how much he hates being wrong. And that detail matters, because accountability that comes with resentment is not accountability, it is self-preservation. At the time, he said his failures came from not knowing how to be a good husband or father, that he genuinely believed he was doing things right and misunderstood what those roles required. And yes, on the surface, that sounds reflective, but then he added that he hated being blamed, and that resentment made him resistant to taking ownership. And when that was pointed out, he quickly accepted it verbally and moved on. And that is where many people felt the disconnect, because real accountability lingers. It is uncomfortable. It does not disappear the moment the pressure lifts. When I watched that episode, my reaction was not empathy, it was skepticism, because there was no evidence of change, only carefully chosen words designed to end the confrontation and move forward. And that distinction is critical, because words can be rehearsed, but actions cannot. And that brings us to why this interview matters, because instead of reinforcing growth, it quietly dismantled it. During this interview, Cody openly admitted that he was not fully honest with the drill instructors, that he said what he needed to say in that environment because he felt pressure. And what he admitted next reframed everything, because he essentially acknowledged that the accountability viewers saw was situational, not sincere. And that one admission changes the entire narrative. He immediately circled back to the same explanations he has always used, that the children were victims of the divorce, that they were forced to choose sides, and that the structure of polygamy created division. And while systems can influence dynamics, they do not erase individual behavior. And this is where the pattern becomes impossible to ignore, because instead of examining his tone, his choices, his presence, he redirected responsibility outward again. He described the separation from his children as a natural drift, something that happened to him, something that hurt him, something intensified by public criticism. And that framing matters because it positions him as passive in a process that required active participation. And this is the consistent thread through every version of this story. He is always affected, never accountable. Impacted, never responsible. And then he said something that revealed more than he intended when he explained that things became toxic because flaws and faults were being pointed out on television by others. Because what he is really saying is that the environment changed not because behavior changed, but because silence ended. For years, the narrative was controlled, financially, emotionally, structurally, and when that control weakened, the truth surfaced, and that shift was intolerable, not because it was false, but because it was visible. And here is the question I want you to sit with as we continue. If accountability disappears when pressure is removed, was it ever real to begin with? Because what followed was a familiar explanation framed as insight. He blamed the platform, the criticism, the exposure, but remained within the platform because leaving would require sacrifice. And blaming the environment while continuing to benefit from it is not accountability, it is convenience. And then he explained that during special forces, he felt the only acceptable response in that military-style environment was full responsibility. That partial responsibility equaled full culpability. So he said what he needed to say to survive. And that admission quietly dismantles the redemption arc because it confirms that the words were strategic, not transformative. And if that is the case, then we have to ask, what else has been performative? What else has been said simply to end discomfort and avoid deeper reflection? Because real accountability does not disappear when the cameras stop, and real growth does not require pressure to exist. And this is why this moment feels less like a turning point and more like confirmation, because the pattern remains intact, just delivered with different language. And that realization is what makes this interview matter more than the episode itself, because sometimes the truth is not revealed under pressure, but after it, when people feel safe enough to take their words back. And once you understand that the accountability was conditional, everything else starts to line up in a way that is impossible to ignore. Because after admitting that he told the drill instructors what they wanted to hear, he immediately began rebuilding the same narrative he has relied on for years. A narrative where responsibility is always shared, diluted, softened, and redirected outward rather than held internally. He explained that in reality, the breakdown of the family should be viewed as mutual responsibility. And on the surface, that sounds reasonable until you slow down and examine what the original question actually was. Because the drill instructors were not asking him to divide blame between adults. They were asking about his role as a parent, about how he handled his relationships with his children, and about why those bonds deteriorated. And instead of staying with that question, he pivoted away from it. And that pivot matters because it reveals discomfort with accountability that cannot be shared. When he reframed the issue as shared responsibility with his former partners, he avoided the central truth that parenting responsibility does not operate on equal footing with children, because authority, power, and choice do not exist evenly in that dynamic, and responsibility follows power. And when you are the one setting the tone, the rules, the emotional climate, and the expectations, you are also the one responsible for the outcome. And this is where the explanation begins to unravel, because he repeatedly describes the distance with his children as something that simply happened as a natural drift, as a painful but unavoidable consequence of divorce, rather than as the result of repeated interactions, patterns, and choices over time. And that framing removes agency from the one person who had the most influence over those relationships. And then he adds another layer by explaining that everything became toxic once criticism became public, once flaws were pointed out, once other voices were allowed to speak. And again, that detail matters because it reframes honesty as harm and accountability as attack. And when truth becomes the problem, the issue is not the truth, it is the loss of control. For years, the story remained stable because the narrative was tightly managed, and when that management loosened, discomfort followed, not because things suddenly changed, but because they could finally be named. And instead of sitting with that discomfort, reflecting on it, and asking what repair might look like, he reacted with anger, frustration, and withdrawal, and later explained those reactions as human emotion, as though feeling upset justifies behavior. And while emotion is human, how we handle it is a choice, and accountability lives in that choice. He then addressed the question about the non-disclosure agreement and dismissed it with humor, minimizing it as routine legal advice tied to property matters, and insisted it had nothing to do with silencing anyone. But explanations do not exist in isolation. They exist alongside records, timelines, and public documentation. And when those do not align, questions naturally follow. And instead of meeting those questions with transparency, he brushed past them and moved on. And that pattern, again, mirrors everything else. Say enough to pass the moment without engaging with the substance. And then came the most revealing admission of all, when he explained that in the Special Forces environment, he felt compelled to take full responsibility because that was the expectation. And in that statement, he unintentionally revealed that accountability for him is performative, situational, and responsive to authority rather than internal and consistent. Because when accountability is internal, it does not depend on who is watching or what the consequences might be. It exists even when it is inconvenient. And as the interview continued, the reactions around him became just as telling as his words. Polite pauses, subtle tonal shifts, professional distance, moments that felt less like agreement and more like polite confusion. And sometimes the clearest feedback is not verbal, because outside of a controlled environment, patterns stand out more clearly. Humor lands differently, confidence reads as deflection, and explanations feel rehearsed rather than reflective. And even he acknowledged that people find him irritating, that he talks too much, that he ignores social cues, and shrugs it off as personality. But personality does not erase impact, and repeating that justification does not make it less true. And when you step back and look at the full arc, what becomes clear is that the accountability presented on television did not translate into sustained reflection or change, because it was never rooted internally. It was a response to pressure, not a commitment to repair. And repair is the only real measure of accountability, because words without follow-through do not heal relationships, rebuild trust, or change outcomes. They simply reset the narrative until the next moment of pressure arrives. And this is why this interview feels less like a contradiction and more like confirmation, because the pattern remains intact. The explanations shift, but the center does not. And the question that lingers long after the interview ends is not whether he lied under pressure, but whether he recognizes the difference between saying the right thing and doing the necessary work. Because until that distinction exists, the story will continue to repeat, just with new language, new platforms, and new opportunities to perform reflection without living it. So here's the truth, after all of it. What we just watched was not transformation, it was repetition. Accountability that only appears under pressure is not accountability at all. And when the words disappear the moment comfort returns, the pattern stays the same. The real question is not whether he admitted to lying, but whether he even understands that he did. Because until actions change, the story will keep repeating. And now that you see it, you will notice it every single time.